Welcome to Qualitative Research Designs Part 2. This session builds on the first half of the Qualitative Research Designs presentation, in which I introduced you to the different traditions of qualitative research. I gave you some insights into some specific details around those designs. We spoke a little bit about the basic principles and the expectations and the philosophy really that drives much of what qualitative research is about. This session builds on that, and we consider some of the data collection approaches that exist. I also will introduce you to some of the considerations that people will generally have when they collect qualitative data. And these considerations are useful when you're thinking about how you defend the choices you've made in terms of the designs that you choose or the methods that you utilize. It's also a good way of kind of critically presenting your choices. So, and when I say critically presenting your choices, I mean if you choose make a particular qualitative research design choice, then you will know that if you're going to defend it or talk about it, it needs to be defended in this way or in that way. And so this presentation kind of is intended to build a holistic, critical understanding of the design choosing process. It also builds on the idea that I will introduce you to basic entry level and intermediate level and sometimes advanced level concepts that relate to the designs, but that is enough of a building platform for you to pursue some of the detail on your own through looking at some of the materials that I have shown you and just progressing them beyond what I had identified for you. Sorry, for a second I was getting a little bit worried that I wasn't actually beaming myself across to you. So I hope that you can, it might appear to be a screen thing at this moment, but what I have behind me is a little bit of a snippet of the presentation. Once again, with all these presentations, we will email you a complete PDF version or a PowerPoint version of the actual slides that you see. In the meantime, you'll just have to put up with the visual exhibition of them as I speak through each of them. Now, as always, I'm going to just turn off the camera very quickly and get into the business of this second part. And remember, you have a 5-part series that we have run this week. We had Quantitative Designs Part 1, Quantitative Designs Part 2. We had Qualitative Research Designs Part 1, and today it's Qualitative Designs Part 2, which will then be followed by Mixed Methods, which is really an amalgamation of the qualitative and the quantitative. Right. I shall just put this up. And once again, I must remind you that the first session spoke at length about what the standout philosophy, the principles, the assumptions that are central to qualitative designs, and the things that qualitative methodologies prioritize. They are all highlighted in the first section. And now what we do is just walk you through some of the actual methods that are used within this paradigm. And of course, if you remember, these methods that I will refer you to for use across the board. So they, people who do phenomenology may find some of them useful. Those who do grounded theory, ethnography, biographical research, participatory action research, case study research, and historical research. Those are the different traditions of qualitative research that I introduced you to earlier. And of course, this part of the methods of collection speaks to each of these possibilities. As you listen, you may recognize that some of the methods I describe are much better fit for particular types of traditions. And that is what a choice that you'll be able to make on your own as you proceed through the work. Right. So when it comes to deciding what data collection method you're going to use, and these are questions that people generally ask when they are thinking about the data collection methods that they will pursue specifically within qualitative research. The quantitative research questions may differ somewhat, but the logic of entry and the logic of how you consider the needs that you have, the data needs that you have, is pretty much uniform across all types of research. So we know that the research questions that you have, and for some of you, you may just have objectives, but the objectives that you have will guide the kind of data collection methods that are open to you. So, and in specifying which methods you will use, there are a number of questions that you need to consider as a researcher. So firstly, maybe I need to explain this idea that the research question or your research objective guides your data collection method. Say if you had an objective that was to do with, your first objective was to determine what people's opinions are in relation to whatever the concept is. If you're determining human opinions, then clearly the only methods that are open to you are the methods that allow you to access human beings. So it then immediately opens up the possibility of an interview, the possibility of a focus group, and the possibility of probably some self-reporting format like a questionnaire or a survey that people have to complete. You then have to ask yourself, out of these options that I've identified, what are the limitations of the interview versus the focus group and so on, until you get to a point where you have weighted out the things that relate to the different methods, so you find yourself in a space where you have chosen a method that you are most happy about. So, of course, there are principles that drive you. Remember, in qualitative research, we are always interested in in-depth exploration. So the fact that one method can guarantee you depth may set it aside as being the preferred method because the other methods might not guarantee the same level of depth. Also, in qualitative research, you want to have the opportunity to be able to clarify and re-clarify things. So if you used a stagnant method like someone completing a questionnaire, if there were things in their responses that you couldn't understand, you would find yourself ill-placed to be able to pursue those things. So automatically you realize that if you want to follow the assumptions, the priorities of qualitative research, you start to find that certain things are better approached by using things that are much more transactional, much more things that allow for you to clarify at that point with the participant. There may also be other issues at play, things to do with whether the phenomena you're interested in is best represented by one member of that phenomena, or whether you might do better to speak to groups at a singular time and so forth. But those are the kind of things that you think about when you're thinking, I have a research question, I have a research objective, and I think I can satisfy it with these 4 things. How do I decide whether those 4 things are the right things for me? So in essence, what I would do later on in this presentation, I will talk to you about certain considerations that people have when they consider the competing benefits of one method versus the other. But of course, along with this generic application of you looking at whether the research question is best answered by a particular method, the next set of things that are up for play for you will be things such as asking whether your data that you need will be best collected from a primary or secondary source. And what I mean by that is, are you going to collect your data from the horse's mouth? Primary means the people or individuals that are going through whatever the phenomena is. Or if you are going to opt for a secondary source, such as a report that's been written ahead of time, sometimes people will review retrospective records, and that then becomes one of the considerations that you as a researcher have to consider when you're thinking about what data collection method will work for you. Then, of course, the other thing that you ask, this is a question you ask before you've even decided whether you're going quantitative or qualitative, but you would ask whether the data you're looking at are primarily objective or subjective data. By objective data, we are asking whether the type of data you're seeking to understand is data that is factual and wouldn't change regardless of interpretation and so forth. So if, say, you are interested in people's ages, how old they are, that data, whether you ask the person while you're facing them or facing away from them, the answer will always be the same. So that's a sign of an objective type of data. But there are some data that is subjective, where the way you approach people, the time you approach them, the power relationship between you and you as the researcher and them, all of those things become factors that influence the type of responses people will give you. So clearly, that type of data that you would get would be subjective, and as such, its subjectivity means that all those minute details, those factors that feel like soft influences, suddenly become much, much more important. So maybe the fact that you're a man collecting data from women may change things and so forth. But when you're deciding on a data collection method, you ask this question: are your data primarily objective or subjective? You also need to ask questions about the level of structure that's inherent in the data collection approach that you have selected. So most people will consider whether the thing that they are looking at or the phenomena that they are looking at may require that they actually point people specifically when they ask them. So, and what I mean by that is, if you ask somebody a very structured question where you say, look, could you please tell me what negative experience you had in relation to this? That is quite a structured qualitative question, because you've asked people as if you are assuming in a structured way that they all had some negative experience to report. Whereas if you were doing a less structured questioning approach, you would ask people just to tell you what their experiences of a particular phenomena were, without actually directing them to recounting only the negative. So that question is another consideration you ask yourself: will my data be highly structured or will it be minimally structured? And then, of course, there are some types of data collection instruments and tools out there that require someone to be trained specifically in their use. And there are, of course, those that are the opposite of that, that can be that do not need training. So in your mind, you have to ask yourself, will the data that I retrieve need to be retrieved by trained personnel, or will it just be by someone else, or could it even be by self-report? Then you also ask the question about whether the data that you need to look at will be statistical or narrative. Of course, the issue around objectivity and subjectivity, the issue around a statistical or narrative analysis, all those are issues that are at the heart of whether your piece of work is qualitative or quantitative. So as I've said, one of the first things when you're deciding whether or not or how you're going to collect data, you need to make decisions about whether the data will be from the primary participants or primary people that experience the phenomena of interest, or are you going to go to a secondary source that has collected information from them and actually just review that information? All these choices that I'm referring to have their advantages and limitations, and the idea with you as a researcher is that when you make a choice, you do so with a full understanding of what limitations it comes with, what possibilities it offers, and sometimes there are feasibility challenges that have driven you in a particular direction. And if that is the case, you would then make it very, very specific from you would make it very specific from the beginning of your decisions about data collection, so that you are directed as to whether it should be primary data or secondary data that you look at. Okay, now many of you will be asking, what is the difference between primary and secondary data? And I've just done a slide that talks about how each differs from the other. But in essence, primary data is the data that you collect directly from the source that is experiencing the phenomena. And then secondary data is that data that you get from data sets that have already been collected, so pre-existing literature, and sometimes when they were collected for a reason that is different from yours, but they exist nonetheless. So primary data, of course, have high specificity because when you collect them, you collect it specifically for the purpose that you're interested in. So when you sit with a participant and you ask him a very specific purpose for your study, you create and craft the question in such a way that it specifically relates just to your work and not to other previous people. But if, say, someone had that same question that had been asked to different people 5 years ago for a different study, and they had a data set for that, then of course the answers that are contained there would be less specific to to your current interest, so they have lower specificity. The primary data option, by virtue of you having to run through all the protocols of interviewing a single person at a time, it is the primary data source is time consuming to collect. Secondary data, of course, is much quicker and economically efficient. So if I said to you, you need to interview 20 people, or you can go and do a literature review and find out about this from Google, doing a Google search on things, the person who does a Google search will find it much easier than the person who has to approach human beings and engage with them from building a rapport, getting consent, and so forth. Then, of course, primary data is known to have high variability. And this is to do with the fact that every subject comes with a different set of factors that describe them, and of course the researcher may change from time to time, or the researcher's perceived rapport with the person from whom they are collecting data will change from one participant to the next. So there's a lot of variability in the way that that plays out. Secondary data, the data is dead, it's on a paper, it's not going to present itself in different ways on different days. So actually the concept of variability does not even come up really, because the material that you look at in secondary data is matched. You have matched it with the specific variables that you're interested in, and you know with some level of certainty what to expect, because you pulled out only those things that mattered to you. Right now, so in data collection, there are typically 6 types of data collection methods where things generally fall under. You have the physiological measurements, and this relates to people, measuring your temperature, measuring how many respirations you have in a minute. We have psychometric instrumentation. That's when you measure physical things like people's height, the span of their hand. Then, of course, there are questionnaires which relate to paper-based questions that people complete. There's the interviews. And when we speak about interviews, we are sort of talking about them as if interviews are just individual interviews, but there are some contexts and some books that will describe individual interviews and group interviews as interviews, and not one being individual interviews versus group interviews. The group interviews are generally the equivalent of focus group discussions. Then, of course, the other option is the final option after interviews and focus groups is this collection of data by observation. So you may sit and watch individuals go through a particular experience, and you make observations about that. These data collection methods generally fall into one of 3 major types of data collection methods, and those 3 are self-reports. Now, self-reports are those things that generally rely on the participant answering questions themselves. Self-reports are very versatile. They allow prospective, cross-sectional, and prospectively focused explorations. They also allow for a much more direct engagement with the person going through the phenomena. The weaknesses, of course, include the fact that when people are self-reporting, their sense of what is really going on is affected by a lot of interpretational issues. And sometimes just issues like accuracy and memory recall all become a problem with self-recall. Of course, there's another issue that may exist with self-reports, that there are particular subjects that have excite people in very specific ways, and those subjects can sometimes make people either be overly exaggerating in their feedback, or sometimes they actually kind of curl up and don't say enough. But there are a number of techniques that are out there to be used to kind of minimize the negative impact of these actions. For example, the technique of indirect exploration of a sensitive issue is a great one. So, and what I mean by that is that if, say, there are a lot of people who do studies with children, And when they do studies with children, rather than ask children directly about the traumas that they've experienced, what they might do is say things like show a visual image and ask those children to talk about that visual image and how it reminds them of particular events in their lives. So they kind of end up making it sound like they're talking about the visual image when really they are being asked to express things about themselves. The second major type is observation, and this is really to do with, as the word says, observation, to do with watching, and that is entirely based on people using the human sense of observation. You know, they watch, they listen, and they feel, and those types of things would generally fall under observations, or sometimes people do so with the aid of technical apparatus. So you may have a meter that can check people's heat. So when you talk them through things that are anxiety provoking and so forth, the apparatus would show an increase in someone's core temperature, that sort of thing. So, but a major type of viewing things is observation. The strength about observation is that if done in the way we understand it, it's one of those things that's relatively inobtrusive. And what I say about something that's unobtrusive is that obtrusivity, and we'll discuss this a bit later, relates to the extent to which a particular data collection approach interferes with the participant who's being observed. So observation is great in that it's unobtrusive. So what it means is that it really doesn't, you can observe people without them knowing they are being observed. They would not necessarily have to change their lives to accommodate your interest in them, and so forth and so forth. So it doesn't interfere with the human in that way. Of course, one of the other things with observation is it can give multiple perspectives, because you observe things from different angles with different background understandings of what's going on. The weaknesses is that with observation, there's a risk of observer bias. There's a risk also that if people are aware they are being observed, they may distort their behavior to account for the fact that they know someone is watching them. And this we call reactivity. So if you tell someone, say, for example, who is treating customers, you tell them that your boss will be watching you, they will behave differently from someone who has not been told. Then, of course, there are issues, a whole range of ethical difficulties with observation, because in theory, the best observation happens when the person who's being observed has little or no awareness of the fact that they are being observed. But the ethical requirements require that people need to be told, they need to be made aware of it, they need to opt in, and so forth and so forth. But that whole tension behind the fact that you get your best observations when the participants don't know, versus versus the fact that participants not knowing is generally unethical. All those things are problematic. Of course, there are ways of dealing with these things and minimizing them. One of the approaches that exists is that people might seek blanket ethical clearance, where they tell the people they are watching that, look, I am going to be here and I'll watch you for the next month. I may watch much harder on day 2 and not so much on day 4, but I'm asking for your permission to watch you. And then what you would do is watch people quite closely for the first few days until they get used to it or actually forget you're there. And then they become much more natural in their behavior, and you can get a much more cleaner sense of what it is that they are doing. The next set of methods that exist is this biophysiological measures. And these are really to do with the measurement of biophysical variables. Being able to measure someone's height, measure someone's reporting of pain, and so forth and so forth. So really the major types that we've spoken about are the biophysiological measures. We spoke a bit about observation, which was shown earlier, and then we also spoke about self-report. Now, when it comes to data collection approaches in qualitative research are usually described in terms of the 4-dimensional aspects that relate to them. So, and when I say described, when you are choosing which approach you want to use, when you are choosing which data collection approach works for you, the considerations you have are to do with things like the structure of that data collection approach. Do you want it to be highly structured, semi-structured, or unstructured? And I will speak to you about what that means. You also consider its quantifiability. Do you want something that can later be turned into figures, so you have numbers for what you saw? Do you want, then the next thing is to do with researcher or obtrusiveness. Do you want a data collection approach where the participant or the person from whom you're collecting the data is aware that data is being collected, or do you want a thing where they are not aware? Then, of course, there's that whole debate about, do you want something that is that has much more objective potential or rather than subjective potential? So in terms of the issues with structure, you really have the first are the highly structured data collections methods, which are typical of quantitative studies, where people will be asked to give, they are asked 20 questions, and maybe in those 20 questions, they're given 4 potential options that they're allowed to choose from. So these, of course, mean there's a limited scope of elaboration for the person who's being questioned, but they're very easy to analyze because everybody has chosen one of the 5 things. Of course, in qualitative research, we tend to go for much more loosely structured formats because they allow for a much more in-depth exploration of the phenomena. But of course, the very fact that they are unstructured means that the feedback you get from people will be quite varied and can sometimes cover things you didn't expect. So it's much more difficult to analyze. The next consideration is this consideration that relates to whether the quantifiability of something. And this relates to the extent to which the resulting data can be statistically quantifiable. So if you are a researcher and you ask people to answer you, but you give them options that they're allowed to choose as their answers, then of course, when you finish, you can say, out of the 50 people who answered, 12 answered this way, 12 answered that way. So in a way, you've created the whole questioning in a way that allows for quantifiability. But some people might want to choose something that's less quantifiable, where they go with things that don't need to be counted. So if I ask you to give a narration of experiences, and I just want to hear what your experience was rather than to count how many people had the same experience as you, then I would go for low quantifiability in my choice. Then the next dimension that people look at is this dimension of obtrusiveness. And with obtrusiveness, It really relates to the extent to which the method you've chosen brings awareness to the subjects about their status as being people who are involved in a study. So essentially, if you think about some of the methods that I've offered to you, things like collecting data through observation works best if the researcher is aware that they need to find an unobtrusive option of collecting data, because once the person from whom you're collecting data is aware, then you can expect that there's a high level of distortion in the way that they act and respond to you. So generally, the higher the obtrusiveness, the lower the higher the obtrusiveness of something, as in the higher the fact that the participant knows that you're researching them, the more likely it is that they would distort their behavior to kind of meet what they think you expect them to meet. So, and of course, lower obtrusiveness also is associated with increased risk of ethical complications. So in ethnography, for example, people will do what they call covert ethnographic inquiry, where you want to study a population, but you don't tell them that you're studying them, you just become one of them. This is the sort of things that people do, say, if they were studying the world of criminals, you know, the culture of criminality, they would pretend to be a criminal themselves and spend years just pretending to be a criminal while they covertly watch what the culture of criminality is. That method brings a lot of ethical complications, primarily because the subjects of inquiry are not aware that they are indeed being studied. Then, of course, the other fact or dimension that is of interest is this competition between objectivity and subjectivity. And remember that with objectivity, we are really saying that we're interested in the extent to which two independent researchers would arrive at similar scores if they were querying something. So some methodologies, particularly quantitative ones, prioritize objectivity as a key element that they believe shows that they are indeed engaging in a valid piece of work. Whereas, of course, in things that are not positivistic, then we aim for higher levels of subjectivity, and objectivism is not exactly a priority within that space. Now, the next part that we'll look at is issues to do with some of the factors that you need to consider as an individual who is selecting and developing instruments for data collection. So, and now these considerations, they hold true both in qualitative and quantitative research. I've just presented them in the qualitative presentation for the sake of having a place to place them, but really they are the type of considerations that one would expect every student, regardless of methodology, to have when they are deciding what method will I look for, and what are the things I need to think about when I'm developing my instrument. Now, as always, the first thing that you think about is ensuring that you prioritize the fact that your data collection instrument options are fit for the purpose. And for you to understand the purpose, there are things that you need to know about the needs, the data needs that you have as a researcher. So the first and the most basic, but sometimes most complicated thing to clarify is whether this tool that you're looking for bears conceptual relevance. In actual fact, that question is about whether the tool is conceptually aligned with your definition of what it is that you are looking at. So if you are interested in things to do with human responses or human behaviors, then the first question would be to ask if your tool is conceptually aligned with issues to do with behavioral tendencies amongst human beings. The next question that you would ask is whether the resulting data that you would collect with your chosen instrument would meet certain data quality requirements. And this then leads us to this 6-factor plan that talks to how to the range of considerations that researchers should ideally have when they're considering whether the instrument that they have in front of them is the right instrument for the data they need, or if indeed they are thinking of developing their own instrument, then these 6 considerations are critical nonetheless. I will keep this slide up for a second and let you just internalize and assimilate the first 3 of these factors that are important for you when you're doing decision making around which instrument you'll use or the things you must consider when you're developing your specific data collection instrument. Right, so I have shown you the first 3 of the 6 factors. The first factor, of course, is you need to assess whether you have the resources and have access to the resources that are needed to be able to effectively utilize the tool that you want to develop or the tool that you have chosen. And by resources, it may be that some people will choose a tool that requires access to physiological testing equipment which they don't have the resources to access. In that respect, you would then have to rethink whether this is the right tool for your study. The second consideration is around availability and familiarity, and this is to do with whether the tool that you're choosing or the concepts that you want to measure within your tool are accessible to you, and whether you have prior experience of using this particular data collection instrument that you want, and whether it can be used by a novice or if it needs a person who's been specifically trained in its use. Then the third consideration is around norms and comparability. This relates to whether the tool that you're choosing has in fact been standardized by others before you, and if it has been normalized as the tool gets used by people doing similar studies to yours. The next three considerations relate to population appropriateness. Does the tool actually look like a tool that would fit the specified population that you're interested in terms of whether the literacy level expectations of that tool, the age appropriateness of that tool, whether the tool is in a language that your average participant would understand. And all those are issues that you would need to think about before developing a tool per se. The next are things to do with administration issues. Some instruments need specialized administration, and you have to then think about the impact of that on resource planning. The final consideration is reputation. There are some tools that have very high reputational presence, but they've gained their reputation from being used in other fields other than yours. And you have to be aware that this high level of reputation gained elsewhere does not translate to similar in-discipline evaluation. Now, what I have done here is that I've borrowed some things that really are related to quantitative research, but there are considerations nonetheless that may not have been spoken about in the quantitative presentation. And usually, when people don't understand the level and type of information they want, they don't think about the type of measurement they should utilize. So if you're interested in in-depth feelings about something, or if you're interested in in-depth opinions, or if you want people to do comparisons, then you must prepare questions that allow for that to emerge. Similarly, within quantitative research, there's a set of considerations that people take account of, and those are to do with the level of measurement that you're interested in. I've thrown these in here, but will not discuss them now because they are for exploration when we do quantitative research. But I want people to be aware, especially when we later do mixed methods research, that in quantitative research, there are 4 categories of data, of measurement that you work with. There's what's called nominal data, and that data is the kind of data that just allows you to name something. So if I'm collecting data where I collect people's names, their gender, their marital status, their ethnicity, it gives me a name to attach to the participant. But beyond that, I cannot then say, deduce anything else apart from the fact that these things have different names. Ordinal data allows me to do it's nominal data, but it's nominal data that has been presented in a way where there's a gradient. We can rank things. So I'm able to say, look, here's a pain scale. Those who had no pain, to those who had some pain, to those who had little more than some pain, to those who had a lot of pain. You can select where you fit. But in ordinal data, we know the order, but we don't have a measurement of the intervals between the order. So we can't say someone who says they had very little pain differed by this amount from someone who said they had more than just a little pain. So ordinal data is better than nominal data, and that is not name only. It gives an order to what it is, but that order has no intervals. Then the next level of data is this interval data, where we are able to rank things, but the ranking actually has intervals that are measurable between the units. So if we ask people to provide their age, their height, we know that someone who's 12 years old compared to a person who's 15, they may differ by 3 years. So if you collect data and your data is in the interval a data level, measurement level, then you are able to make comparisons between the things that you've discovered. But if you had done that using ordinal or nominal data, you cannot make those comparisons. And finally, there's this thing that we call ratio data, which is really interval scale data, but it has a true zero. So for example, someone's weight allows you can compare people's weights, but you can't weight as an absolute true zero. You don't have someone who is minus 5 kgs. So everything stops and dies at that 0 point. I will leave this issue of pre-testing of your data collection package, but when you are presenting or have a data collection instrument that you work on, the expectation is that you're meant to introduce a way that you assure the reader or the examiner that you will be able to pre-test or to pilot this thing that you have developed. So there's an expectation that you talk about it. In qualitative research, the piloting is done in a very specific way. In quantitative research, it's done differently. What happens now is the next few slides relate to a session that we will have a bit later on. And then the next session after this will be a very, very brief run through some of the data collection tools that are open to you. But at this stage, we will stop now. And the data collection methods that we'll look at basically gives more information about observations. We'll speak a bit more about interviews, questionnaires, the use of documents, and the use of audio-visual materials.